So it's important that fiduciaries understand what their legal obligations are first, and then move on to, hey, we want to do what's right for the participants.
This is 401k Specialist Editor-in-Chief Brian Anderson, and this is the 401k Specialist Podcast. This is a special edition of the podcast where it is part of a broader new deep dive coverage of a specific topic, and that topic for the first quarter of this year is a provocative one titled How Not to Get Sued. We've got a bunch of in-depth coverage from a variety of angles being rolled out in the coming weeks, and you'll be able to find it all right on the 401k Specialist website. Today on the podcast, we're happy to be joined by Eric Dyson, Executive Director of 90 North Consulting and one of the retirement industry's more active ERISA expert witnesses. A U.S. Naval Academy graduate and former nuclear-trained submarine officer, Eric brings mission-driven precision to fiduciary governance, investment oversight, and compliance. He's testified in more than a dozen ERISA cases and helps plan sponsors understand what courts and the Department of Labor actually expect. Welcome to the 401k Specialist Podcast, Eric.
Brian, thanks for having me. I'm excited to share some thoughts with the listeners. Thank you.
All right. Well, as we start talking about lessons from litigation and how not to get sued, I want to start with learning a little bit more about 90 North Consulting and what your day-to-day focus is on.
Sure, but let's be brief on that because I want to get to what teaching is. The listener, but thanks. So just to be clear, 90 North Consulting, kind of a trivial point, but I've got a separate legal entity called 90 North Expert Witness where I do the expert witness work that we're going to talk about. But to your point, and thanks for asking, 90 North Consulting is where I stay current, where I'm rolling up the sleeves and helping plan sponsors, advisors with hopefully moving the needle on retirement readiness. The biggest project, the biggest lift I do is advisor searches for plan sponsors. And just real briefly, that is mostly retirement, but I also do health broker searches for plan sponsors. That's becoming a little more in the main focus with some of the transparency rules. So advisor RFPs are the biggest lift. As people are familiar, sometimes you don't need a full RFP or decide it's time just for a benchmark. I do independent benchmarks. And then real quickly, a potpourri of other things, but two I want to point out is I do a little bit of collaboration with Don Trone and his folks at the Behavioral Governance Institute. Got a really great AI tool that I've been able to contribute to some of the knowledge there. And lastly, very recently, just based on what I think the need is and what we're talking about here today, I've launched an online ERISA training platform, mostly geared towards plan sponsors, but the knowledge level is basic and a little more advanced for the advisors. That's probably enough of describing what we do at 90 North.
Great. Great. And happy to hear that you work with Don Trone. He's one of our frequent contributors as well. Now, so when you go out and do speaking engagements, your presentation is generally titled Lessons from an Expert Witness. Tell us a little bit more about the lessons you're teaching and why it's important to share the information.
Yeah, and I try to make it current. And for just the podcast here, I don't want to make it just the current items in view of your overall theme here, how not to get sued. But I have this concept. You'll see it on my poker chip business card. The title of my podcast is Be More Than a Fiduciary. But I want to talk about that because I share it over and over. And the idea here is, Brian, I probably should have looked up this reference, but there's a reference from litigation that says, a pure heart and an empty head are not enough. The concept being that planned fiduciaries who have the best interest in mind, they want to do what's right for participants, right? They're showing up, they're trying, but they don't quite have some of the basics right. This idea of being more than a fiduciary, and what I tell people is you've got to get your legal fiduciary obligations in place first, okay? And I give the metaphor of building a house, right? The foundation is not something you look at. You don't walk up to a house to purchase and say, hey, let's take a look at the foundation, but it is critical, okay? So it's important that fiduciaries understand what their legal obligations are first, and then move on to, hey, we want to do what's right for the participants. Now, in some way, they're joined at the hip, but let's get the legal part correct. So here's two other quick things as an example I'll give. I tell audiences the number one most simple thing you can do to avoid scrutiny, to mitigate risk, is to write a check for your record keeper, write a check for your advisor. In other words, do not use plan assets to pay for those plan expenses. Now you're allowed to do that, but if you write a check, no one can ever question, did you pay too much? All right. I quote a DOL investigator, all right, public forum. I put up my hand and I said, hey, if a plan is paying too much for record keeping and they write a check, do you care? And right away, most straightforward answer I ever got from anybody in the government was, by definition, I do not care because the participants are not paying for it. So that's it. And I'll end with, just where I started, but it goes one step more. They need to ask all the right questions. Another story I tell is, challenge your advisor, challenge your record keeper. This is not a question of distrust. In fact, it's an issue of trust to be able to dig down and ask some deeper questions.
Right. Okay. Well, from what you've seen, what would you say? What are the biggest, most common mistakes plan sponsors tend to make that put them at risk? And for most plans, is the bigger risk, is it private litigation or is it a Department of Labor investigation?
So the numbers in that are easy. There's no doubt the more common or most prevalent risk is a Department of Labor investigation. And I looked at this a couple years ago, Brian. If you look at all of the let's limit it to defined contribution plans in the United States, okay? And if we randomly pick a number of $500 million and up and say those are the plans most likely to be subject to litigation just by size, that's less than 1% of all plans in the country. All right. So very unlikely that class action litigation comes up. Now, the opposite side of that, I did get requested to be an expert witness in a case. It wasn't class action. It was an individual lawsuit, so those can still come up. But that's really, I think, the bigger risk. And the Department of Labor comes knocking on the door. And just, I want to bridge the gap there. I did one expert witness engagement with the Department of Labor. Sometimes they have to actually sue plans. So here's what I think, and I gave this a lot of thought for the audience. I did get a hand of a couple questions here, but not actually calculating compensation. Okay. And I serve on a couple plan committees, and on one committee, nationally known record keeper, a very good relationship manager. I said to him, hey, I need the last 12 months of compensation that you received as a record keeper. And also putting into perspective a $100 million plan. So some people will call it mid-market. And his response to me was, wow, nobody's ever asked me that before. Think about that, all right? $100 million plan, well-known record keeper, very confident relationship manager. No one had asked, show me how much the record keeper made in the last 12 months, all right? Now, it's not just that question, but if committees would do that, right? Ask advisors, ask your service providers, how much did you make from us in the last 12 months? And that's not, I'm not suggesting we're trying to squeeze them for fees. It's an accountability issue. But the plan sponsor also forces themselves to look at how much did we pay this service provider? Maybe, and especially with the record keepers when there's a fee concession, right? Well, how do we get a fee concession? How much did you make off the managed account? Or how much did you make in float income, et cetera, okay? And as a reminder, the 408B2 disclosure notifications in retirement plans do not have to be submitted by your service provider each year. They need to submit it as requested, but I think that's the biggest flaw, is that committees don't count those beans. What did we actually pay? And in litigation, there's, generically speaking, two types of litigation. It's either investment performance or fees. Forfeitures is a big issue right now. I'm setting that aside. But investment fees are record keeping fees. Boom, just go count the numbers. And then the other side is in the investment side of it. So I started out not counting numbers, right? And if I'm going to go into the investment side, I would say the biggest mistake is the committee relies too much on the advisor on the investment policy statement. They kind of figure out, I don't need to understand this thing. I'm going to let the advisor do it for me and get more engaged. So let me summarize a very long answer, Brian. And I apologize for that, but count how much you paid and make sure you understand the investment policy statement.
Right. Okay. Well, now I'd like to drill down a little bit on one of the kind of common issues. Is it permissible to pay TPAs with plan assets, and where does all the confusion come from on this?
The answer is yes, it is permissible. Okay. And this goes back to, some of the core fiduciary duties of loyalty and prudence. All right. Loyalty being exclusively in the best interest of the plan participants. Prudence being I'm operating as though I'm knowledgeable and an expert familiar with such matters. But the key phrase there is deferring, only reasonable fees. All right. So let's start with I mentioned already that the easy way to get I don't want to say a pass on this, but if the plan sponsor writes a check, well, then by definition, the plan is not paying. The participants aren't paying. So yes, it's permissible, but it's now incumbent on the plan sponsor, on the committee, on those fiduciaries to determine if the service they're receiving are reasonable for what they are paying. So the flaw comes in there, and in litigation, you'll see both sides, plaintiffs and defense, going, well, wouldn't you agree that you don't have to have the lowest cost record keeper, lowest cost investments, et cetera, et cetera. That is true, but the flaw ends up being, did the plan sponsor really determine what was best? Is it reasonable for the fee we're paying? And I think that's the best way to answer that question.
Now, how about the issue of properly documenting a plan's QDIA selection? I've seen you say that a lot of people don't do this correctly to take advantage of safe harbor protections. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
This is a pet peeve of mine because this is one that it's, in my opinion, black and white, easy to fix. You just have to know what you don't know, what you're not doing. So when people think of QDIA and they think of the safe harbor, service providers, advisors, plan sponsors, they all kind of think, well, we have to give them that notice, right? Because QDIA is the default. Typically, it goes with a default enrollment at 3, 6, whatever percent, but you can actually write a plan document to have a QDIA without automatic enrollment. Okay. And most people think, well, as long as we give them notice, as long as we monitor it, we're good to go. Here's what people skip is the possibilities for QDIA, a professionally managed account, some kind of a balance account or a target date fund. Step one is determine of those three options, which ones are appropriate for the plan. And nobody has a deliberation or meeting minute entry to say, we have determined that target date funds are an appropriate default for our plan. Okay. Now, put a pause there. We'll come back to that. All right. Because probably people thinking is, well, when would a target date fund not be appropriate? All right. The safe harbor is if you decide for your plan that, okay, a balanced account would be appropriate, managed accounts could be appropriate, target date funds could be appropriate. The safe harbor says that you now do not have an obligation to compare one against the other, right? And that's what most people miss. They never make some kind of affirmative election that we've determined this is appropriate for our plan. And plans that use managed accounts for the default, I think it's important that they all do it, but it's very, very, very important if you use a managed account that you make an affirmative statement, this is appropriate for us, okay? So that's the one that people were missing. So let's go back to target date funds. People say, well, when would a target date fund not? I mean, everybody uses them. When would it not be appropriate? There was a time, I don't know if it's true today, but if you had a very small plan with a record keeper, they may require you to use their proprietary target date fund suite. All right. So for all and I actually had a case back in 2008. So that dates it, but it's appropriate that I can actually use names to explain it here. 2 years after Pension Protection Act, this is when Voya was still ING. Consolidated 20 different vendors for a 403B plan. 403B plan liked ING as their provider, but they were only allowed to use the ING target date funds, which only had a 2-year track record. Here's an example of when a plan decided this target date fund is not appropriate for a default. Okay. So it's very possible. Actually, I don't want to say very possible. It's probably out there, not practical these days, but so the answer is make that determination, whatever you're using as your QDIA, you state an election or state affirmatively, this is appropriate for our plan.
Okay, makes sense. Now, moving on to the subject of RFPs, how often should plan sponsors conduct RFPs or benchmarking to make sure they're demonstrating a prudent process?
Okay, well, let me start with the buzz phrase of every 3 to 5 years and where that comes from, okay?
Okay.
And the buzz and it is a buzz phrase, all right? It's from the initial 408B2 disclosures, okay, the regulations where the Department of Labor stated that the department assumes that plan fiduciaries do an RFP at a minimum interval of every 3 to 5 years. Right? Not direction, not law. It's just this statement made by the Department of Labor that they assume this, okay? So the place to find what I think is the operative language. Of course, the operative language, you have this duty of loyalty and prudence as an ongoing duty. But if you go to the Department of Labor, either publication or their website, understanding your fiduciary responsibilities. That's the title of the document, just so we're clear for the listener. And if you open up your search engine, type in understanding your fiduciary responsibilities, TOL, it'll be number 1 or 2 on the list. And I did write this down for a quote. It says, you should establish a formal review process at reasonable intervals. Okay. So that's the language. And I know, so in direct answer to the question, Brian, how often, right?
What's a reasonable interval?
It does not say, right? It does not say. But I think if you go 10 years without doing a benchmark or an RFP, people would argue that's not reasonable. And so here's the other, let's call it anecdotal piece of information I would share on this. I mentioned already that I did one engagement with the Department of Labor. And we were still kind of coming out of lockdown. And what I mean is all the meetings I had with them were virtual. But I would typically have 6 to 7 attorneys on those calls with me, which was, as you can imagine, a little bit intimidating. But it wasn't about the RFPs and benchmarks, but they would ask me a couple cases, well, Eric, what do you see other advisors doing? What's typical in the marketplace? And I kind of thought, and I want the listener to think about this. Here's the Department of Labor asking, what is typical in the marketplace? Okay. So if we go back to the courts and litigation or the Department of Labor, right, this phrase of you should establish a formal review process at reasonable intervals, the only way to figure out what is a reasonable intervals is see what is everybody else doing. Okay. And if everybody else were doing this once every 10 years, I can't see how that would actually happen, but then that would be reasonable. Okay. But I go back to some Callan studies, which give different numbers on different years, but you can see in any given year whether a plan did an RFP or an RFI for third-party services, it's anywhere from 20 to 25% of them are doing that, okay? And if you look at the separate topic of benchmarking, 90% of those plans benchmark at least every other year. So that's my references. What we see in the industry is a benchmark at least every other year, and typically an RFI or RFP, typically every 3 to 5 years is what we see.
Right. All right. Well, that's some very helpful information there. Well, in doing some of the research and the interviews and the editing for 401k Specialist's new deep dive on this how not to get sued, one of the things that has popped up repeatedly is meeting minutes, which is something I hadn't really thought much about before in this context. In your view, what do good committee meeting minutes look like, and what's one thing that should maybe never appear in them?
Brian, here's why I love this question because of all the speaking I had been doing. That was one of the items, a couple years ago I didn't have on my agenda, but it kept coming up as a very common question. So plan sponsors want to know this, they want to know the answer to this question. So you said what should not appear, and I'll cover that. But I will tell you this, and I've seen this in litigation with very large plans. If it's 2 paragraphs and doesn't have a start time and an end time, and it's a copy and paste for 8 quarters in a row, and I have seen that, that's not where you want to go right now. So I thought about this a little bit, come up with a good answer that's general enough to serve everybody, but not vague. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is not a surprise. You want to document the decisions were made and why you made them. Okay, everybody knows that, but I want to make sure we cover that. Now, oh, by the way, some decisions are made outside committee meetings, right? Where benefits is meeting with the record keeper. I mean, I can't imagine that every Secure 2.0 decision was made in a committee meeting, right? There was a lot that took place. So, ladies and gentlemen, listeners, make sure you're documenting those decisions by email somewhere, somehow, okay? And here's what I give as the additional guidance for meeting minutes. Do they demonstrate loyalty? Do they demonstrate prudence? Okay. So a black and white simple, this does oversimplify it a little bit, but if your meeting minutes say that our advisor presented the quarterly investment review, the committee asked some questions. That tells me we had a meeting, right? I don't know if you spent 2 minutes in that investment review or you spent 2 hours. I don't know if, somebody asked, well, what page is that on? That could have been the question.
Right.
Something that demonstrates loyalty and prudence is we did the investment review with the advisors. One fund was on watch. It's been on watch for this many quarters. We discussed this, the plan for next, right? And I think, like I said, it's black and white. That's an easy one. Just as I read it, does it demonstrate a process? Okay. And so the last thing that you asked was what should never appear in that? And I got to really think about this. And here's my answer. It's loose ends. Okay. And here's what I mean by that. I had this conversation with somebody about a week ago. And think about this is one of the powerful ways we can use AI in our business right now. All right. A lot of people are concerned about how we use this, but you should write your action items and then future meeting minutes should reflect what did we do in those action items. Okay. So imagine you just use the most basic use of AI. Advisor committee. Let's upload our last 4 committee meetings into an AI tool, whatever you use, Copilot, ChatGPT, scan for any action items so that we can list them and determine we've done them all. Okay. There's a great use of AI. So what should never appear is loose ends, action items that aren't accounted for.
Great. Interesting. Okay. Well, before we wrap this up, let's close out with some quick takeaways. If a plan sponsor listening today could fix maybe just 3 things before their next meeting, what would you tell them to prioritize?
Let me give you one thing that we really haven't talked about, but does come up in litigation. I mentioned up front, and I don't mean to make this self-serving, but I told you my ERISA training platform is something I'm very proud of. But I would kind of come up with a plan for how to get all the committee members trained properly for their ERISA fiduciary duties. Okay, are they new? Maybe they need a little more training. If they're seasoned, do it. But document and come up with a plan on how you're doing that. The other items I would review, I touch very briefly on it. If you as a committee have not discussed with your advisor, your record keeper attorney, how you're handling forfeitures based on the prevalence of forfeiture lawsuits, I'd look at that. But I'd go back to one of the first things we talked about, Brian, and say, based on the time, right, we're not too far off of December 31st, but talk to your advisor, talk to your record keeper and say, hey, I'd like to see accounting of you, the advisor, and the record keeper. Give me an accounting of all the revenue you received last year. Okay. And that helps you with a number of things, right? Does it match what your service agreement says? It helps you understand, are we getting this is how much, the bad side of that, we're paying our advisor how much, right? And I'm not saying there's a widespread conspiracy here, right? But if you think you're paying a service provider too much, then have that conversation either on service level or fees. And again, I'm not suggesting we squeeze the service providers. For the advisors, I think you ought to be able to document that well enough. Let's look at the flip side of it. Sometimes advisors, you need a pay raise, right? You've been on a flat fee and collected it. So let's just say that plan fiduciaries, count your beans, how much revenue has gone to pay for your services, get some good ERISA fiduciary training, and I'd say, what's the plan for the next 12 months? And all the things we talked about, there's no way everybody's going to do in the next committee meeting things we talked about. But if they plan that out for 12 months, that's available. And Brian, I can offer to anybody who wants it, reach out to me on my website or on LinkedIn, but I have a outline for training that's about a 12-month training document. I make that resource available to anyone for no charge.
Great. Eric, this has been really enlightening. I feel like I've learned some lessons. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just one element of our new deep dive coverage on how not to get sued. Be sure to check out the 401k Specialist website for more. Eric Dyson, Executive Director of 90 North Consulting, thanks for joining us today and sharing all these insights on the 401k Specialist podcast.
Brian, thanks for having me. Sincerely an honor. Thank you so much.